Hello and thanks for watching Q&A with me, Varashni. Today we're interviewing Premier of the Western Cape and Leader of the Opposition, Helen Zille. Thanks for joining us, Premier Zille. When I first interviewed you a few years ago on camera, I'm not sure if you remember, it was before the 2009 elections, you were adamant that the DA would prove itself through good governance. And in fact, you weren't too pleased with me for bringing up race perceptions of the DA. But there's a growing critique of the DA that they are ignoring the emotional needs of South Africans, particularly around issues of race. Issues of racial hurt and baggage that are still very much alive if recent events are anything to go by. In a recent column about the spear, Justice Malala wrote, "There is a hurt that is still not processed. There is a pain so infinitely deep and huge that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done virtually nothing to assuage it." Black and white South Africans are in need of a truly visionary person who can lead us through this minefield of race. Is there a DA leader capable of making us do that?
I honestly don't think there is a single leader anywhere that can do that. Eventually, everybody has to face themselves and face what it means to create one nation with one shared future and what reconciliation means in that context. And I think the DA is very well positioned to lead that reconciliation effort.
The DA is very well positioned, I would thoroughly agree with you, but I would say that they have not used that positioning and they have not used what's happening in this country to both the country's advantage and the party's advantage. They've been remarkably either quiet or a little bit callous about these issues.
Well, I think that the real issues, apart from the horrific historical injustices of apartheid, are how we build a future that gives everybody freedom they can genuinely use. And the way we tackle those issues is looking at the things that are the most painful for people. Poverty, unemployment, no jobs. That is the number one issue by a long, long way for South Africans.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all, but I would say that there has been a very pragmatic, something I said in my column that you didn't like, very pragmatic approach by the DA to these issues, which I fully laud. But if I had to quote political analyst Eusebius McKaiser, I felt he wrote a very insightful piece about the DA, where he argued that people don't only vote with their head, but also with their heart. He said that the trick is both to move voters and explain to them what skills you have that your political opponents do not have. The DA obsesses about one part of that strategy, skills, facts, data, and totally neglects the other part of the political game, speaking from the heart. What is your response to that?
I think politics is all about the heart.
I'm glad you think that.
Oh, absolutely it is. It's all about the heart. And it's all about your place in the world and in society and your hope for the future. And it's that sense of owning the future and overcoming the past where the DA needs to position itself. And that is why we're getting so much support from young people, because they're seeing in the DA the vision of being able to do that. And they're seeing within the DA the government of the next 10, 20 years. And that's why we're attracting so much enormous talent.
But what would you say to criticisms that the party has sometimes seen quite tone deaf on the issues of racial hurt? So, for instance, I was at a talk where Eusebius was also at this talk where a UCT graduate asked Lindiwe, how do I get confidence to enter the marketplace? And she was kind of shut her down and said something like, you should have confidence by virtue of being a UCT student. Someone else mentioned a tweet where someone spoke to you on Twitter about living in a shack, and they misspelled the word shack, and you kind of mocked them for that. And there's this idea that often when we want to talk about racial hurt, racial issues, the DA will say, you're just playing the race card, we're not going to engage with you. What would you say to that kind of criticism?
Look, all of us in the DA are also fallible human beings. And we might make a witty comment to a person who doesn't think it's funny. That happens every day in interaction between human beings.
Yeah.
And as I said, that rugby pun on the word shark was an interaction on Twitter. And I meant it lightheartedly in the context of the rugby matches that were on at the time. And certainly no offence was meant, but I've learned not to do puns on Twitter, that's for sure.
And not to assume that people understand certain things.
But there's also a point at which we also need to interact freely. And so many people are able to take it well, and we found that in all the surveys we've done to work out where the DA's potential support base lies, it's not a race divide and it's not a class divide. It's what we call a psychographic divide. People, whether they're living in shack settlements or in boardrooms of companies, whether they're black or white or anything else, it's those who are confident in themselves, have a vision of themselves in a future South Africa, who are optimistic about the future, who believe in their own power to change their lives. Those are the people who support the DA. And we call it a psychographic divide, not a race or class divide. And I think many of the analysts need to move on from being stuck and mired in race and class, because there's a new way of analysing South Africans, and it's the DA way.
That sounds really wonderful, but for me it often has sounded very idealistic to think that there is this undercurrent of post-race that the DA is going to capture. When analysts like Stephen Friedman, when all kinds of people have said race is an issue. It's not just an issue for the ANC. Yeah. The ANC is not inventing this issue.
Of course it's an issue. It's a huge issue in South Africa. It's a massive, massive issue. But the truth is that if we face that issue honestly and say that South Africans don't have a future unless they build it together, with empathy, with understanding, with mutual respect, with reconciliation, there's no future for anyone. And those are the people who are supporting the DA.
Well, let's move on to social media, which is a whole other form of engagement that you have pioneered as a politician in many ways. And yet there's been quite a lot of controversy around that as well. There were many people both inside and outside your party who were unhappy with your choice of words about people moving from other provinces to your province in search of better education, and you describing them as refugees. How did you come to resolve that situation, and what was your personal process?
It's a medium rife with trolling. People are always baiting you. And because of the 140 character limit, you have to find very constrained ways and concise ways of saying things. And if people are always looking how they can catch you out and how they can abuse what you're saying in a context that you didn't intend, then of course it is rife with dangers for any politician. So we've learnt a lot, and I certainly never use the word refugee out of a context. I use it in an educational context. In fact, I said education refugees to define the lack of options that people have in the places where they're growing up if they want a decent education. And so obviously it was an ideal opportunity for people to seize on a word, to give it a different context, and to mobilize emotion around it. I mean, I realized very soon that it was a stupid thing to have done, that I should have anticipated that kind of manipulated reaction. And, I am used to manipulated outrage. I'm used to what I sometimes define as pseudo-outrage. It comes with the territory as well. And normally I move on, but when people are determined to get a genuine apology from you to kind of legitimize their outrage, it makes it a bit more complex in the context.
And of course there were those in your own party who weren't entirely comfortable with the language either because of what it meant for their constituents.
Well, we have very open debate in the Democratic Alliance. We are not a one-man band or a one-person show in this outfit. We have lots of debates. We've just finished a weekend's federal council with lots of very open and often quite direct debates. So I'm used to this in the party. We have these debates, and that's the kind of show I like to run. We're not a dictatorship.
And what do you think have been your biggest mistakes on Twitter?
Well, I am now doing things quite differently. I am now saying, just ignore this person. I don't have to reply to this person. And
so you're learning to filter out the trolls, because there was criticism that came from a social media expert that you tended to, what we call in the internet, feeding the trolls, that you tended to respond to those people who were base and...
Well, the truth is that I didn't even know about trolling before Twitter.
Okay.
You have to learn all of the vocabulary. You have to learn all of the mechanisms. It took me a long, long time to work out how Twitter actually works. I didn't know that when you reply to someone, it only goes to that person's followers.
Okay.
I thought it went to everybody. Yeah. And I make mistakes. I mean, the price of doing anything is that you make mistakes. And then you learn through your mistakes.
I've noticed that you've toned down, or in a sense, you've been more careful when you've been tweeting. Has that come out of a process of going, it's not worth the outrage that meets these kind of things, and even if you do believe that perhaps your black professional tweet was merited, your refugee tweet was merited, and that the issues were important?
Look, I think my Twitter feed is much more boring than it used to be. Twitter is a very, very dangerous medium. You can't see what somebody's eyes look like. You can't get tone across in Twitter. It only comes through as outrageous rather than something with a twinkle in the eye. And often there isn't enough space to put a winky face on either. So when you've got 140 characters, you have to edit. You have to be very concise in what you're saying. You have to use shorthand.
And you have to be aware of the history, I would say. You've got to be aware of the context and people's own racial baggage and hurts.
Yeah. Well, you see, you often can't work out anybody's baggage. You certainly can't from their name.
Yeah.
Because so many people are free from any baggage. And other people in the most surprising places aren't.
My final question about your future and the party's future, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question. When are you going to let Ndube Mazibuko take over?
Well, I'm certainly not going to choose my successor.
Okay.
Certainly not. And in fact, it would be a kiss of death to any prospective leader if an existing leader said in the Democratic Alliance, you are going to be my successor. We don't operate that way. There's a huge resistance to operating in that way, and I certainly would never do that to anybody. What I'm going to do is be there for as long as the party thinks I should be there. And when I talk about the party, I mean the Federal Congress. And I'll be the very, very first one to say, I've done my bit. I did it as best I could. I made mistakes. I was somewhat controversial sometimes. On the whole, I hope I added value, certainly added more value than I detracted at times. And I will be the first one to say, here, this is the baton, it's for you, run the extra mile.
Okay. Premier Zille, thank you so much for your time with us. We really appreciate it. And that's all from us today.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for
Thank
listening.
you.